Hey guys, it's Jen back here again. I know it's been so long since my last INFJ or relationship psychology related video, and I really miss talking to the camera like this, even though as an introvert it's really hard to improvise on camera. But I love the way I used to do it, so I'm just gonna keep a lot of my videos going like this. In this video, I'm actually going to be starting off a new INFJ compatibility series. I made a poll a couple months ago asking what kind of content you guys would be interested in seeing in the near future, and the overwhelming majority actually chose relationship compatibility. First off, I'm going to get into my personal theory of relationship compatibility and more specifically how it would relate to typology theory. Obviously in this series I'll be talking about type compatibility between INFJ and the other types in the MBTI, and I'll be listing out kind of the pros and cons of each relationship. Before you start thinking about what types you may be compatible with, especially if you're an INFJ watching this video and trying to figure out what type you should be seeking out, I think you need to first establish what kind of relationship and connection you're after at this particular stage in your life. In my opinion, there are two types of plausible relationships that you can select. First, there's relationships of utility, and there's relationships of connection. So I'll start off with describing what a relationship of utility would involve. By relationships of utility, I'm talking about those that just seem to work. It works in a sense that you can have a long-term relationship together and kind of build a future together in a very realistic and practical fashion. So what I mean is that these relationships work because one person's strengths helps to fill in the weaknesses of the other person's, and vice versa. These people kind of work together and function as a unit. Now we see these kind of relationships a lot between opposite types, such as the ENTP and the ISFJ. Because, for example, where the ISFJ can't really stand up for themselves and use logic and rationality to process and make decisions, the ENTP comes in and backs them up. And where the ENTP can't really take care of themselves and, deal with the day-to-day, functioning of things in an organization, the ISFJ comes in to give them a boost in that. So that's an example of a utility relationship, because when they work together, they get things done, basically. You can get married, you can have children, you can save up for a house, etc., get things done. These relationships can lack a depth of connection. And that's no wonder, because if you're in a relationship of utility and one person's strengths is the other person's weaknesses, then naturally a lot of your interests and hobbies probably won't overlap. This may be more true to intuitives because they tend to seek a deeper connection than senses. So maybe true senses in a relationship will tend to be more practical and utilitarian than relationships between intuitives, We're jumping on to relationships of connection. A relationship of connection can be emotional, spiritual, intellectual, and or experimental in nature. These relationships aren't always the most functional relationships because connection is typically intangible and does not always promise a practical aspect to the relationship. These ones are when you kind of find someone who's like your soulmate. That means that you're very similar to them in ways, but because of that, they won't be able to help you on developing your weaknesses because they may have very similar weaknesses. Let's use the ENTP again as an example for a relationship of connection. So an example of a relationship of connection for an ENTP is one perhaps between the ENTP and an INTJ. So they're both NTs, they both share that intellectual connection. However, this relationship is not always practical since one does not adequately fill in the weaknesses of the other. So for an example, the ENTP may need to be taken care of in a motherly way due to his inferior FE and SI, but the INTJ is not good at feelings or the sensory world, so they're not a natural caretaker. Whereas the INTJ may want to develop their practical applications and hone a set of internal values for their FISE, but the ENTP is more interested in group values and is not exactly a practical type. They may run into hurdles when they realize the other person can't help them when they are incapable. However, it is that intellectual connection, unable to be found elsewhere, that keeps their relationship strong. One thing to realize about an ideal relationship, it's ultimately subjective to the individual, what they're searching for at a particular time in their lives. and that type is not the sole indicator for compatibility whatsoever. In fact, it may not be one at all. I used to believe that type was kind of everything, you know, like I would identify so much with my INFJ personality description and personality typology that I thought that typology could explain everything about how someone is. And once you believe that, you kind of believe that relationship dynamics and compatibility all come down to typology. And I found that that wasn't the case. And what I believe is the case for determining relationship compatibility is rather a sharing of similar values, having communication styles that work with each other, sharing similar interests and hobbies. Humour is also very important to me, because if you can't have a laugh with that person, it's hard to have a good time with them, you know. What I've established is that psychological compatibility is a type of compatibility that doesn't necessarily determine relationship success, but it does offer insight into how two people tend to interact, so a type dynamic per se. If there's one thing to take from the MBTI in relationship to relationship compatibility, is that different types will produce a unique type of growth or direction for a relationship to head. So ultimately, for an INFJ to pair up with any other type, there is ultimately no good or bad, right or wrong type to be with. Any type that an INFJ chooses to date will just produce a different result, and we may learn different lessons and have different experiences from dating different people. If we do want to speak in terms of the MBTI, then a rough guide for harmonious connection or compatibility is, first of all, sharing of values that exist within the temperaments. So the temperaments, as most of you would know, are NF, NT, SJ, and SP. If your other half is within the same temperament as you, you'll share a lot of the same values, a lot of the same interests, desires, and even lifestyle. For the NF connection is emotional depth and humanitarian goals. So ultimately we understand each other in a very deep emotional level, and NFs tend to have humanitarian goals, so we try to strive for the betterment of humanity in a very compassionate, empathetic manner. Whereas the NT connection is obviously a very intellectual, scientific, perhaps even philosophical connection, you know, and the goal for most NTs is to figure out a way to navigate the world and their lives in an intellectual manner. And also the seeking of universal truth is very popular amongst NTs, so that would be the kind of a connection they'll be searching for. The SJs share the value of tradition, and they like maintaining and preserving tradition. So things like building a family, running a household, those are very important values for them. So the connection is within the tradition, the conservativeness, and also upholding loyalty and honor. The SP connection is one through sensory pleasure and aesthetics. They, I don't want to say hedonistic, but they really enjoy a very experiential connection. They like to experiment new things, explore different places, and they like to go all out, basically. They like to live in the moment and go on adventures. As an intuitive, I believe the intuitive connection is also very apparent. It's also very popular, but it's not always the case with people, because two intuitives can have completely conflicting lifestyles or opinions or values, so that might not always work. But sometimes intuitives do share very similar beliefs and thought patterns that may allow them to connect on a deeper level. Another thing to look out for in the MBTI is the intuitive and the sensor connection. It tends to be very popular in the concept of opposites attracting. That's why it really depends on what you're after. So if you're after kind of like the wow factor, trying to learn something very different from how you usually are, then maybe an intuitive and a sensor connection would be more fulfilling for you. But if you're looking for more of a connection, like a soulmate connection, I think maybe an intuitive relationship would be more suitable. So in saying all of that, I hope you guys kind of understand where I'm coming from. I believe that the best indicator of relationship satisfaction is never one single theory or aspect. Obviously, personality typology does play a role into relationship success, mainly the beginning of the relationship where you actually feel a certain spark or connection. But at the end of the day, it always depends on what you're after at a particular point in time. So for an example, if you're an INFJ and you're at a stage in your life where you're trying to develop your thinking function, your TI, and you're seeking truth, maybe what you're looking for is an intellectual connection, and you're going to get that intellect from an NT, such as an ENTP or an INTP. But if you're an INFJ in a stage where you're wishing to develop a spiritual, emotional connection, perhaps you're better off with an NF, another NF, such as an ENFP or an INFP. And if you're looking to develop your extrovert feeling function because you want to give back to your community, or you want to develop kind of a career in helping people and counseling people, then maybe you're suitable dating someone with higher FE, such as an ENFJ or an ISFJ. So it really depends on what you're after at a particular point in time, and there is ultimately no right or wrong in your in relationship. You can't say that dating an ESTP would be wrong for an INFJ because you're too different, or dating an ISTJ would be too authoritarian or different for an INFJ, because it ultimately depends on what someone is after. And each relationship is definitely going to teach you something new about yourself.